Upon the completion of the freshly constructed two-family home, my mother-in-law sternly told me to get out of there since I was no longer needed. In actuality, we didn't get a room ready for you. My spouse had filed for divorce before I even had a chance to act shocked. Observe the divorce decree. Joyful. This house will be mine in the property division. He gave me a contented look. I smiled and accepted the divorce papers, keeping my cool. I'm at last free. It was incredibly tiring to pretend to know nothing for so long. My spouse was surprised to see me react in such a casual way. I chose to tell my unaware spouse who I was. My name is Dolores. I work for a corporation and am 32 years old. We've been renting since we were married, but we always wanted our own place. My spouse, Stephen, was hesitant to put his own money toward the construction of the house. Instead, we were to save together. I'm helping my parents out because they're having financial difficulties. When things calm down, I'll assist with saving. When he offered the justification of helping his parents, I was unable to dispute with him. Stephen was self-employed in the transportation business, and because his income was unstable, he never disclosed to me how much he was earning. While he boasted that his income was higher than mine, he hardly contributed to our living expenses. Stephen's parents, whom we lived very close to and who received his support, often came to visit. Stephen's sister also lived in his parents' home, and as she worked from home, she frequently showed up with them. Although his father was already retired and living off his pension, thanks to his working sister, they didn't seem to be struggling financially as much as he claimed. His travel-loving parents often went on trips, and I had been curious about where their travel funds came from. Moreover, during the times his parents were traveling, his sister often came to our house to eat. I was too busy today to prepare a decent meal, so I'll eat here, his sister would say, waiting for me to come home. Although it was convenient because our homes were close, it was troublesome that she wanted to have dinner at our house almost every night. She was waiting for me the following day as well. When I prepared dinner for Stephen's sister, she openly showed her dissatisfaction. This is the same dish as yesterday. I was hoping for something different. I want to eat steak, she said, her complaints about the meal I had prepared amidst my busy schedule making me angry. Despite her dissatisfaction, Stephen's sister finished all the food and left, expecting a special feast the next day. That day, when Stephen returned home, I exploded in anger at him. Your sister came for dinner again today, complaining while demanding that I serve steak or prepare extravagant meals. Why do I have to take care of her dinner? As I spoke with anger, Stephen responded as if it was none of his business. Don't tell me. Tell her directly. Where she eats is not my concern. His response only intensified my anger. I was disappointed once again to realize that appealing to Stephen, who was weak against his family, was pointless. Realizing that Stephen had no genuine intention to build a new home and preferred his family over our life together, my heart sank. Around that time, I received a call from my brother saying that our father had been rushed to the hospital. My father, still an active company employee, had collapsed during work. The situation is quite serious, so be prepared, my brother said gravely. Since our mother passed away, I thought my father was healthy, and the news almost brought me to tears. As I was distraught, my brother asked, "Is Stephen busy at times like this? I wish he would support you, Dolores." Even when I tried to contact my husband, I only received cold responses, making me feel even more alone. I'm too busy right now and can't leave. Besides, rushing there won't improve your father's condition, said my husband, not offering support even in an emergency. Although my father barely survived, he was still in critical condition. From the next day, I started visiting the hospital to check on my father after work. This made me return home late, and my mother-in-law spitefully said, "From tomorrow, we will also have dinner here, so come back early. The nurses will take care of your father in the hospital, so there's no need for you to do so much." Although Stephen's sister had dined at our house before, his parents had never made a special effort to come for a meal. It seemed like my mother-in-law deliberately said they would dine at our house because she disliked that I was visiting my father. This upset me. "Why do you need to have dinner at our house? Isn't it inconvenient for you to come here?" I retorted, trying to contain my anger, but my mother-in-law expressed more anger. "Stephen said we should eat here, so I'm coming reluctantly. If there's a problem, talk to him," she snapped. Even though I couldn't believe that Stephen would say such a thing, when I asked him about it upon his return home, he looked troubled. "Mom said that if Mom says so, I must obey, so it's settled that you will prepare our dinners from now on," he said, seemingly dissatisfied but unable to oppose his mother's commands. As a result, I became responsible for preparing meals for my in-laws. Disappointed by my husband's attitude of prioritizing his mother's instructions, I began to question our future relationship. When his parents dined at our house, it meant that his sister would join them as well. Therefore, I had to prepare meals for 3 additional people. However, I was certain that my in-laws would complain about the food I made, which weighed heavily on my mind. I was fed up with having to prepare under these circumstances. After making dinner, I decided to visit my father and try to avoid seeing my in-laws as much as possible. As expected, my mother-in-law made a spiteful comment. "Don't you want to be with us? Going to the hospital won't cure his illness, will it?" As I was heading to the hospital and ignoring her complaint, my sister-in-law laughed and said, "Dolores's father apparently has quite a fortune, so she must be thinking she'll get a big inheritance by visiting him." Leaving them to their assumptions, I left the house. Since my father was hospitalized, my mother-in-law had deliberately left dinner preparations to me, and her indifferent attitude towards my father's health condition irritated me. My sister-in-law had heard through Stephen that my father was indeed wealthy and that the family owned real estate. I didn't care about the inheritance. All I wanted was for my father to recover. Nevertheless, my father eventually passed away, and I was devastated by his death. "We'll handle the funeral preparation, Dolores, so you can stay by Dad's side," my brother and his wife told me, and they arranged everything. I was grateful that my sister-in-law handled things so efficiently, yet my husband didn't show his face even once. When I informed Stephen over the phone about my father's death, his reaction was unbelievable. "I don't care what happens to your father. What about dinner?" Stephen blurted out. I was speechless at my husband's concern for dinner preparations. Stephen yelled, "Come back home quickly," and hung up the phone. In the end, Stephen did not appear at my father's funeral, and my brother and his wife were displeased with his attitude. How disrespectful of him not to show up at his father-in-law's funeral. He never visited once. What did he really think of Dad? My brother expressed his indignation. I regretted marrying Stephen. After the funeral, when I returned home, Stephen was inexplicably smiling. "Dolores, what did you inherit? I heard your father had a lot of real estate." He asked about my father's real estate without attending the funeral. I glared at him angrily. "That's none of your business, is it? And why didn't you come to the funeral?" I demanded. "I hate funerals. They're such a hassle. But I'd like to know the details of the inheritance," he replied almost gleefully. I told him I inherited nothing, although I hadn't discussed it with my brother yet and didn't fully know the extent of my father's assets. Stephen doubted my words and continued to ask persistently about the inheritance. When I continued to ignore him, he couldn't stand it and apparently called my brother. Stephen called me, yelling to hurry up the inheritance division. "Is he really that desperate for money?" my brother said. Hearing this, I felt embarrassed and apologized for my husband's actions. "I'm sorry. Stephen is only thinking about the inheritance. Please don't worry about my share," I told my brother over the phone, feeling guilty as I heard his concerned voice. My brother seemed suspicious of Stephen's abnormal interest in the inheritance. My brother and I decided to exclude Stephen from the discussions about my father's real estate and we calmly agreed on the inheritance distribution. Having lost trust in Stephen, my brother informed me of his future plans, and I agreed to follow his directions. When Stephen later learned that the inheritance had been finalized, he made a big fuss. "Dolores, what did you inherit? Don't hide anything. Tell me everything." Stephen yelled, and his mother overheard. "If you've inherited the house, share some with me too. I prefer a new house if possible," his mother demanded. Similarly interested in my inheritance, Stephen's sister cheerfully stated her wish. "I'd prefer cash. I want to buy a nice and luxurious apartment with it." As my in-laws built up their convenient fantasies, I calmly presented the facts. In reality, all I inherited was a vacant lot. Indeed, I did inherit some cash, but why should I have to give it to you? Disappointed by the lack of a new house, Stephen's mother and sister frowned upon being refused the cash. Upon learning about the land and cash inheritance, Stephen suddenly suggested cheerfully, "Let's build a new house on that land. A duplex would be great. Wouldn't it be wonderful for us all to live together?" Stephen's mother and sister were delighted with his suggestion, and I responded as my brother had instructed. "Understood. Let's build a duplex on the land I inherited." I readily agreed, and Stephen's mother and sister smiled in satisfaction. But his father seemed to realize something and asked, "Dolores, are you sure about this decision? You really realize this means you'll be living with us?" His usually reserved father seemed surprisingly sharp this time. "Just be quiet. It was because of your low income that we couldn't build a house?" Stephen's mother snapped, and his father fell silent as usual. Since the decision to build the duplex, Stephen started coming home late, saying he was busy, and his parents stopped showing up at the house as often. I painfully felt the spitefulness of Stephen's mother and sister, who had demanded dinner preparations during my father's hospitalization. When Stephen's mother and sister tried to decide the layout of the duplex on their own, I firmly refused. "I will decide since I am providing the land and funds. We'll go with a standard layout, so rest assured." I skillfully avoided a situation where Stephen's mother and sister would have created a strangely structured house by deciding on the layout themselves. I explained to the disgruntled in-laws that while we would share the entrance, the living areas would be separate. To which Stephen's mother sarcastically retorted, "I'd rather not live with you, Dolores. Dividing the living spaces is better for us." Apparently, they were displeased that I was leading the layout planning. Hearing their words, I responded in a low voice, "Don't worry, we won't be living together." My quiet voice wasn't heard by my mother-in-law, but my sister-in-law seemed puzzled and asked me for confirmation. "Did you just say something like, 'we won't be living together,' or 'don't worry'?" When I quickly denied saying anything, my sister-in-law accepted it immediately. As the floor plan was finalized and the construction of the house began, my in-laws were almost daily visitors at the construction site, looking forward to its completion. My sister-in-law, who works from home, often accompanied her mother, seemingly shifting her work hours to the night. As the completion of the duplex approached, Stephen and my in-laws started shopping for new furniture and appliances. New houses need new furniture. Since it's your house, Dolores, could you provide the funds for the furniture and appliances? Stephen suggested, trying to also make me pay for these. I responded apologetically while pretending to be sorry. "I'm sorry, but my funds are depleted, so I'd appreciate it if you could handle the furniture and appliance purchases." While Stephen looked perplexed, surprisingly, my mother-in-law supported me. "Stephen, arrange for the furniture yourself. Dolores has already done enough by building the duplex." It was hard to suppress my laughter at this unexpected support. Looking forward to life in the new house, Stephen and my in-laws purchased a large amount of furniture and appliances, apparently financing much of it with debt. Close to the completion of the duplex, when we visited the site as a family, my mother and sister-in-law began to boast about the furniture and appliances they had bought. "Are you sure it's okay to borrow so much? I definitely can't repay it with my pension. my father-in-law asked anxiously. Unconcerned by his worries, my mother and sister-in-law were optimistic, expecting him to help with the payments. Stephen has been very busy lately and comes home late, but we can repay the debt soon enough. You should help out a bit too, my mother-in-law told my sister-in-law. Suddenly, my sister-in-law was asked to contribute to the repayment. My sister-in-law hastily retorted, "What? I can't afford that. Stephen has to work harder. His job is going well, so there's no need to worry." Listening to the conversation between my in-laws and sister-in-law, I could barely contain my laughter. If my husband's job was going well, he could have made purchases with cash without having to resort to loans. In fact, until recently I did not know, but it seems that neither my mother-in-law nor my sister-in-law knew the exact amount of my husband's income. "Please do not bring in furniture and appliances without permission. There are procedures required," I explained. My mother-in-law visibly showed her displeasure, but my sister-in-law responded meaningfully, "It's the house we will be living in, so we can just wait a bit longer." At her words, my mother-in-law smirked, and I pretended not to notice anything. When the duplex was completed and we were inspecting it, my mother-in-law maliciously said to me, "You're no longer needed, so please leave. We actually didn't prepare a room for you." While I pretended to be surprised, my husband had already presented the divorce papers. "Look, the divorce papers. Happy? I will get this house in the property division." He looked at me with satisfaction. I maintained my composure while accepting the divorce papers with a smile. Then my sister-in-law spoke disdainfully. "Stephen is remarrying, so there's no room for you, Dolores." They looked at me as if they had triumphed, but I returned their gaze with a smile. I'm finally free. Pretending not to know anything for so long was really exhausting, I said. My husband's expression changed to one of shock. "Why are you acting so carefree? You're being thrown out and losing the house," he said. I responded disdainfully. "Divorcing someone who only makes $99,000 a year and who has been proven to be unfaithful couldn't make me happier." It seemed that my husband still didn't comprehend the situation, but my mother and sister-in-law began to panic. "Wait, $99,000 a year? That's not monthly, is it?" my mother-in-law exclaimed, and the smile disappeared from my sister-in-law's face. Just then my brother arrived, and I calmly revealed the truth. I found out about Stephen's affair quickly because my brother had it investigated. I could have divorced sooner, but I decided to enjoy a little revenge because of how terrible you've been, I explained. As I was explaining, my husband tried to deny the affair, but when my brother presented the investigation report, he fell silent. My sister-in-law was aware of my husband's plans to remarry, so the entire family knew about the affair. As my husband's infidelity became evident and he appeared dismayed, my mother-in-law shot me a harsh look. Even if Stephen cheated, if a divorce is decided, there needs to be a division of property, right? Therefore, this house belongs to Stephen, she asserted. Against her convenient interpretation, I clarified the facts. The land this house is built on was inherited from my father and therefore is excluded from the division of property. The funds for constructing this house were also entirely from my inheritance, and the house is registered only in my name. Thus, it is not subject to property division. If I had used the inherited funds for daily expenses, or if my husband had contributed financially to the building of the house, then it might have been considered for property division. However, that was not the case here. Despite my explanation, my mother-in-law was not convinced. Stephen and my sister-in-law, realizing they would not receive the house, were clearly unsettled. "Why didn't you tell me that I wouldn't get the house even after the divorce? I had promised my girl a life in a new home," Stephen exclaimed in anger. Watching this, my sister-in-law murmured in shock. "Not being able to move into a new house. I've already bought the furniture, and now it's all wasted." Upon learning that Stephen's annual income was only $99,000, my sister-in-law became even more concerned about the repayment of debts. Stephen also worried about debt repayment and discreetly sought confirmation from his sister. Mom said that since your income is stable, repaying the debt shouldn't be a problem, right? He asked. My sister-in-law turned pale and just shook her head silently. Facing the pressure of debts, I declared calmly to my husband, given the fact that you committed adultery, I'm preparing to claim a division of property. I will also hold your affair partner responsible. Faced with the reality of a property division claim, my husband tried to retract the divorce and attempted to snatch the divorce papers from me. At that moment, my brother intervened, stopping my husband, and sternly stated, "It is shameful to talk about canceling the divorce after having an affair. We've already started the process for a claim for damages through a lawyer, so you better be prepared." Finally understanding the seriousness of the situation, my husband collapsed, powerless. Meanwhile, rather than worrying about my husband's divorce, my mother and sister-in-law were preoccupied with their own debts and suddenly began to prostrate themselves before me. "Dolores, please help us. You're the only one we can rely on," my mother-in-law begged as she rubbed her head on the floor. I responded calmly, "We are now strangers to each other, and there is no chance of getting the loaned money back." When I responded, my mother and sister-in-law were at a loss for words. Everything had gone according to plan. So as my brother and I were about to leave, my usually reticent father-in-law suddenly spoke up. "I'm getting a divorce as well. I've always followed your mother's commands, but I can't stand it anymore," he said angrily, and left. The new house found Stephen and my sister-in-law, who didn't earn much, struggling to repay the debts, and it seemed everyone was hoping for my father-in-law's pension. It appears that my father-in-law had finally decided to free himself from my mother-in-law's control. As we looked on, my husband and his family panicked and followed my father-in-law out of the house. Watching them leave, I felt a sense of relief, and my brother was smiling contentedly. When I said we were building a new house, Stephen and the others acted just as expected. The revenge on everyone was also thanks to you, brother. I expressed my gratitude, and my brother smiled modestly. It was actually his plan. Afterward, I filed the divorce papers and demanded property division from my husband and his affair partner. My father-in-law eventually divorced my mother-in-law and left the family home. My ex-husband ended up moving back in after I left the house I used to live in. My ex-husband was unable to pay for living expenses or rent and had to return to his mother's house. At the in-laws' house, they were just managing with my ex-husband and sister-in-law's meager incomes and my ex-mother-in-law's pension, barely making ends meet and unable to afford debt repayments. My ex-husband was burdened with monthly payments, his debts kept increasing, and he was even abandoned by his affair partner. The affair partner, due to financial instability, gave up on marrying my ex-husband. My ex-mother-in-law had sought support for living expenses and debt repayment, making my ex-husband's situation even tougher. It's natural to dislike living with such a noisy mother and sister-in-law. From the start, I planned to rent out the duplex and had already arranged with a real estate agency, with tenants already lined up. I decided to utilize the precious land and funds inherited from my father, starting a new life in a one-room apartment. But with rental income from the duplex, I was living a stable life. My brother and his wife occasionally inquire about the idea of my getting married again when I visit them. After failing once, I'm not planning to get married for a time. I answered, I don't want to go through that hassle again. Although my brother was aware of it, his wife suggested, "Don't worry, I'll find you a lovely person the next time." She suggested brightly, "Your father in heaven would be concerned to see you alone." Her remarks moved me, and now I'm anticipating a fantastic introduction. I'm confident that my brother's wife will make the right decision because I know her to be a reliable individual. I put on a reserved front, but on the inside I was eager to see who I would run into next.